The dust in Redemption Creek didn't just settle, it judged. It clung to the air that morning with a gritty, silent malice, coating the tongues of the righteous and the damned alike. It was the kind of dust that got into everything, into the seams of your clothes, the lines of your face, and the cracks of your certainty. And at the center of that swirling, accusatory cloud walked Eliza Vance. She wasn't bound by rope. The town was too civilized for that, or perhaps just too cruel. They preferred a different kind of bond, an invisible tether woven from shunning and scorn. Her chains were the 50 pairs of eyes that followed her, the rigid backs of the women who had once shared tea with her, the stony silence of the men who had once tipped their hats. She was being marched not by force of arms, but by the sheer crushing weight of their collective will. Her small valise, holding the only things they hadn't seized, felt heavier than granite, weighted not with possessions, but with the full measure of their hate. Leading the procession, though not in front, was Mr. Harding. He walked to the side, his polished boots somehow immune to the grime that caked everyone else. Harding was the town's banker, a man built of ledgers and sharp angles, his face a precise mask of civic duty that barely concealed the vulture beneath. He didn't need to shout. His presence was enough. He was the conductor of this silent, hateful orchestra, and the town followed his tempo. They were good people, or so they told themselves every Sunday. They were farmers whose hands were cracked from labor, merchants who prided themselves on fair trade, mothers who raised their children on Bible verses. But a month ago, the Redemption Bank Trust had collapsed, shuttering its doors with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet valley. The savings of a lifetime, gone. The dreams of expansion, of sending a child to school, of a comfortable old age, all turned to ash, all vaporized by one man's greed. The architect of this ruin was Eliza's husband, Thomas Vance. Thomas, the charming merchant, the town's favorite son, the man who had promised prosperity and delivered only dust. He had done the one thing the town could not forgive, and then he had done the one thing they couldn't punish. He had died. A sudden fever, the doctor said. A convenient escape, the town whispered. And so, their rage, cheated of its primary target, had done what communal rage always does. It had sought the next nearest vessel. It had found Eliza. In their minds, she must have known. She, with her quiet books and her Eastern manners. She who never quite fit their rough-hewn mold. She must have been an accomplice, living high on their stolen futures, a silent partner in their destruction. The fact that she was as shocked as they were, that she was a victim herself, was an inconvenient truth they chose to discard. Eliza kept her chin high, a small, futile act of defiance. She focused on the worn tips of her boots, one step after the other. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She had cried them all out in the pre-dawn dark, when the notice was hammered to her door. Forfeiture. The word was as cold as the iron lock they'd placed on her home, the home Thomas had bought for her. She had lost her husband, a man she was now discovering she had never really known. She had lost her good name, and now she was losing the very ground beneath her feet. The whispers were the worst, sharp and low. Accomplice, one woman spat. A woman whose child Eliza had nursed through the grip last winter. Thief, a man muttered, the same man who had sold her flour on credit just last week. They had taken everything. Her furniture, her mother's locket, her wedding silver. They left her only the gray wool dress on her back and one small bag, a testament to their mercy. Mr. Harding had overseen the repossession himself. He had walked through her parlor, tapping his cane against the piano, the keys sounding a dissonant, mocking chord. Town's assets, Mrs. Vance. We must all make sacrifices for the good of the community. His sacrifice, it seemed, was merely the unpleasantness of casting her out. He was the one who had lost the most, he claimed at the emergency town meeting, his bank ruined by his trusted friend, Thomas. His performance of a man betrayed had been flawless. He had positioned himself as the town's shepherd, gathering what remained of his flock's shattered trust. But as he looked at Eliza now, his eyes weren't filled with the grief of a wronged neighbor. They were cold, assessing, and satisfied. There was a personal hunger in his gaze, a possessive triumph that terrified Eliza more than the entire crowd combined. It felt less like justice and more like a carefully orchestrated expulsion. They reached the dry creek bed that marked the edge of Redemption Creek. This was it. Point of no return. The crowd formed a silent, unmoving half-moon behind her, a human wall ensuring she could only go forward into the unforgiving expanse of the high desert. Harding stepped forward, holding a piece of paper, the official decree. By order of the Redemption Town Council, Eliza Vance, you are hereby exiled. You are forbidden to return under penalty of law. Your husband's debts are paid. He didn't mean with money. He meant with her. He was paying the town's anger with her banishment. A single sacrifice to appease the many. She looked back one last time at the faces she had known for 3 years. They were no longer neighbors. They were a mob, united in their loss and their blame. She was the scapegoat, the price of their peace, the final ledger entry to close their account of grief. She turned her back on them, on the only life she had. She took her first step into exile. The dust of the open trail stung her eyes, or perhaps it was just the tears she had sworn she wouldn't shed. There was nothing ahead, no food, no water, no destination, just the vast, empty promise of oblivion. And just as that crushing, absolute loneliness threatened to shatter her composure, a new sound cut through the suffocating silence. It was the heavy rattle of a farm wagon, the steady clop of hooves, and the sudden, sharp cry of a child. The wagon loomed suddenly, a dark shape against the pitiless bright sky, rumbling to a halt just yards from where she stood. It was Silas Croft's wagon, a rig as weathered and unyielding as the man who drove it. Silas himself was a man carved from the high desert rock, broad-shouldered and silent, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat that looked as old as the surrounding hills. He was a rancher who kept to himself, a man of few words and even fewer social graces, known more for his prize bulls than his conversation. Beside him on the bench sat the only two things in the world that seemed to tether him to the human race, his 6-year-old twins, Leo and Mia. They were small, bright sparks in the dusty landscape, their faces smudged with dirt and jam. The town largely left them alone, just as they did their father. They were considered half wild, motherless, and a little strange. As the wagon stopped, the twins, who had been listlessly kicking the floorboards, looked up. Their eyes scanned the grim tableau, the hostile crowd, the self-important banker, and the lone, dust-covered woman. And then, recognition flashed. Mia's small hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. Leo's jaw went slack. This wasn't just Mrs. Vance, the banker's wife. This was their Eliza. This was the woman who, for the past 4 months, had been their secret. It was a secret born of childish loneliness and a woman's quiet, aching need to be useful. They had found her by the creek, where she went to read, and she had found them, hungry for stories, for a kindness their stoic father didn't know how to give. She hadn't just been a merchant's wife, a social ornament, as the town believed. She had been their teacher. 3 times a week in a hidden copse of willows, she had sat with them, her finger tracing the letters in a worn copy of Shakespeare, her voice soft as she sounded out the words. She had brought them gingerbread. She had taught them to read. She had been, in those stolen afternoons, the only mother they had ever truly known. Now seeing her, not with a book in her lap, but with a valise in her hand and the town's hatred at her back, their small worlds fractured. This was a violation. This was a wrongness their 6-year-old minds couldn't process but felt, with an agonizing, visceral certainty. Before Silas could even register the scene, Mia, the quieter one, scrambled over the wagon's side, her bare feet hitting the dust. She ran, a tiny, determined figure, straight past Mr. Harding, past the shocked silence of the crowd, and threw herself at Eliza, her arms wrapping fiercely around Eliza's waist, her face burying itself in the folds of the gray wool skirt. She clung to her, a desperate anchor in a sea of cruelty. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Of all the things they had expected, this was not one of them. Silas Croft's half-wild girl, clinging to the town's pariah. Leo, always the bolder, the protector, stood up on the wagon bench. His face was red, his small fist clenched. He saw his sister. He saw Eliza's pale, stunned face, and he saw the wall of angry adults. His father was silent, a mountain, unmoving. Fear and fury warred in his small chest. He did the only thing he could think of. He pointed, his small arm rigid, his finger aimed not at Harding but straight at his father. His voice, high and trembling but carrying with shocking clarity in the dead silence, ripped through the air. "Daddy!" he cried, his voice cracking. "Daddy, you have to marry her." The demand was so absurd, so profoundly childish, and yet so devastatingly public, that the crowd froze. Even Harding's self-satisfied smirk wavered. People stared, mouths open, unable to comprehend what they were hearing. Leo, desperate, tears welling, shouted it again, louder this time. A desperate plea and a furious command all at once. "Don't let them take her away. She's ours. You have to marry her." Eliza's knees buckled. She clutched Mia, her own shock a cold wall against the child's trembling warmth. Marry her? The words were a nonsense sound, a child's impossible solution to an adult's brutal problem. She looked up, her eyes finding Silas Croft's. His face was still in shadow, unreadable, but she could feel the sheer, unadulterated shock radiating from him. He was a man who lived his life by avoiding this very thing. Complications, emotions, and above all, the town's undivided attention. And now, his son, his own blood, had just thrown him into the very center of the fire. He was the spectacle. He was the one trapped, pinned by the absurd, desperate, and heartbreakingly loyal cry of his child. The silence that followed was heavier than any rock, thick with the unasked question, what would the silent rancher do now? Silas Croft sat motionless, a man pinned to his seat by the eyes of the entire town and the impossible demand of his son. He was a man who prized silence, who built his life around the solid, predictable rhythms of the land, far from the petty, shifting judgments of Redemption Creek. And now, in one terrible, burning moment, he had become the center of its most scandalous spectacle. He could feel the collective intake of breath, the giddy, cruel anticipation. They were waiting. They were hungry. Mr. Harding, seeing the ranchers stunned in action, saw his moment to reclaim authority. He laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "This is absurd," he scoffed, gesturing to Eliza and the clinging child. "This person's fate is a town matter. It is none of your concern, Croft. Take your brats and move along." The word brats landed like a whip. Silas's gaze, which had been fixed on the empty horizon, slowly lowered. His eyes, dark and unreadable under the shadow of his hat, moved. He looked at Leo, still standing on the wagon bench, defiant and trembling, a tiny soldier who had just fired his only cannon. He looked at Mia, whose small body was fused to Eliza's, her knuckles white. And finally, his gaze settled on Eliza Vance. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't pleading. She was just holding his daughter, her face a pale mask of shock and a pride that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He saw the raw red mark on her arm where someone in the crowd had grabbed her. He saw the dust in her hair. And he saw, in the rigid set of her spine, a woman who had been brought to the absolute edge and had not yet fallen. His decision wasn't a thought, it was an instinct, as sharp and sudden as a hawk striking. He didn't speak. He simply rose from his seat, a slow, deliberate unfolding of height and muscle. He stepped down from the wagon, his heavy boot landing in the dust with a soft, final thud. The crowd instinctively shuffled back. Silas Croft was not a large man by comparison, but he carried a density, a stillness that promised violence if provoked. He walked past Harding as if the man were a fence post. He stopped in front of Eliza. He looked down at his daughter. Mia. His voice was low, not unkind. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right." He bent, and with one arm he gently detached his daughter from Eliza and lifted her. He turned and placed her on the wagon bench next to her brother. "Stay," he commanded. Then he turned back to Eliza. He didn't offer his hand. He simply gestured to the wagon with a tilt of his head. "Get in." Eliza stared at him, uncomprehending. "Mr. Croft, get in." It wasn't a request. She fumbled with her valise and his hand shot out, taking it from her. He tossed it into the wagon bed. Then he put one hand on her elbow, his grip impersonal, firm, and all but lifted her onto the bench. He rounded the wagon, ignoring the stunned, open-mouthed faces of the townsfolk. He climbed back into the driver's seat. He took the reins. Harding, sputtering, finally found his voice. "Croft, you can't. This is an official act of the council. You are interfering with—" Silas turned his head, just enough to fix the banker with a look. It was a look devoid of heat, as cold and flat as a winter river. "She is," he said, his voice cutting through the air, a direct answer to Harding's claim that it was none of his concern. He then looked past Harding at the entire crowd, a silent, sweeping dismissal. "This is over." He snapped the reins. The horses, startled, lunged forward. The wagon wheels bit into the dust, and they moved, pulling away from the frozen tableau of the thwarted town. Eliza didn't look back. She just stared straight ahead, the sound of the wheels a roar in her ears, drowning out the sudden angry shouts that erupted behind them. The ride to the ranch was a new kind of prison. The silence in the wagon was heavier than the town's hate, thick with unspoken things. Silas stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his entire body rigid with what Eliza could only guess was a deep, simmering anger. He was a private man, and she was the trouble he had just publicly invited in. The twins, sensing their father's mood, were unnaturally still. Mia tucked under one of his arms, Leo staring at his own boots. Eliza sat at the far end of the bench, her hands knotted in her lap, feeling the vibration of the wheels, the heat of the sun, the shame, the terror, and the confusing, agonizing prick of gratitude. They arrived at the Croft homestead. It was not a home. It was a function, a stark, weathered house, a solid barn and corrals, all built for endurance, not comfort. There were no flowers, no porch swing, no sign of a woman's touch. It was a place of work, as hard and unyielding as its owner. Silas pulled the wagon up to the barn, not the house. He got down, lifted the twins, and set them on the ground. "Go inside, both of you." They scrambled off, casting one last worried look at Eliza. Silas rounded the wagon and pulled her valise from the back. He didn't look at her. He just jerked his head toward the barn. This way. He led her not into the main stable, but to a small lean-to room built onto the side, likely for a hired hand. He pushed the door open. It was clean. A narrow cot, a washstand with a pitcher, and a single wooden chair. The air smelled of hay and old leather. He placed her bag on the floor. He finally turned to face her, his eyes still shadowed. "You can work," he said, his voice flat, transactional. "You'll cook for me and the children. You'll clean. You'll earn your keep." He paused, and his gaze sharpened, pinning her. "I did this for my children, not for you. You bring no more trouble here, Mrs. Vance. Do you understand me?" Eliza, her throat tight, could only nod. He lingered for a moment, as if to say more, then turned and left, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the dim, quiet room. Eliza understood the terms of her new existence perfectly. The barn room was a cell of his grudging charity. The work was her reparation. She accepted this. She rose in the dark, the cold floorboards biting at her bare feet, and she worked until the last embers of the fire turned to ash. She was repaying a debt, not just for the rescue, but for the trouble her very presence brought to his door. She would make herself so useful, so essential that her utility would outweigh her shame. She would earn her keep. The house itself was a fortress of male solitude, a place that had been without a woman's hand for so long it had forgotten what it was missing. It wasn't filthy. Silas was a man of military precision, but it was hollow, lacking the small comforts that transform a structure into a home. She began by banishing the silence. She scrubbed floors until the pine grain gleamed. She aired out the stale rooms, beating the dust from the heavy blankets. She found a small, overgrown patch of herbs near the back step, rosemary and thyme, and began adding them to the bland, functional stews Silas cooked. The first time she baked bread, the smell of yeast and molasses filling the kitchen, the twins crept in, their eyes wide, as if witnessing a miracle. They were her shadows, Leo and Mia watching her with a silent, desperate hunger. She was Mrs. Vance to their father, a formal, cold title that built a wall between them. But to them, when he was out on the range, she was just Eliza. She mended their clothes, patched the knees of Leo's trousers, and restitched the arm on Mia's corn-husk doll. She was careful not to overstep, not to mother them in a way that would provoke Silas's anger, but her hands, it seemed, had a kindness of their own. Silas watched, silent and assessing. He had brought a burden home, a soft-handed town woman, and he was waiting for her to break. The first crack in his certainty, however, came not in the house, but in the corral. He had a gelding, a magnificent, stubborn beast that had a reputation for a vicious buck. He'd thrown every hand on the ranch. Silas was in the ring, fighting the horse, a battle of wills that was all muscle and fury, when Eliza appeared at the fence. "You're pulling his head too tight," she said, her voice calm. Silas, his arms burning, his temper frayed, glared at her. "He's a rogue." "What do you know of it?" "I know you can't force a horse to trust you," she replied, her eyes on the animal, not him. "He's afraid of the bridle. My father raised horses." Silas, out of options and intrigued despite himself, spat in the dust. "Be my guest." He expected her to back away, cowed. Instead, she slipped between the rails. She didn't approach the horse. She just stood, her hands loose at her sides, and she began to talk. A low, soft murmur, not words, just sound. She stood there for 20 minutes, a still point, in the dusty circle, until the horse, its flanks trembling, lowered its head and took one hesitant step toward her. Silas watched speechless as she stroked its muzzle. He said nothing when he took the reins from her, but the look he gave her was different. The second, deeper crack came a week later. It was late, the house dark and still, the twins long asleep. Eliza, unable to rest, was nursing a cup of weak tea in the kitchen when she saw the light still burning in Silas's small office. She found him there, his head in his hands, a stack of ledgers and receipts spread before him like a battlefield. He looked up, his face grim, and she saw not the stoic rancher, but a man drowning in a sea of numbers he didn't understand. "What?" he grunted. "You're being robbed," she said simply. He stiffened. "What did you say?" She stepped into the room, her fear eclipsed by a sudden, sharp certainty. She pointed to an invoice from the Redemption Mercantile. "You paid this bill, twice, once by draft, and once in cash to Mr. Harding, who said he would settle it. And this price for feed, it's double what it should be. You're being bled dry, Mr. Croft." Silas stared, his mind struggling to catch up. "How can you—" "My husband," she said, the name a cold, hard pebble in her mouth, "was a man of many appetites, but he was also meticulous. I kept his books." A new, dangerous energy sparked in her. This she understood. This was not a bucking horse. This was a column of figures, and figures, unlike men, did not lie. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his chair. He nodded, stepping aside. She sat, pulling the heavy ledger toward her. She ran her finger down the columns. Then she paused. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was the only thing she had managed to grab from Thomas's desk in the frantic moments before Harding had cast her out. It was her husband's private diary, the one where he recorded his real business. "I brought this," she said, her voice low, "because I needed to understand how he could have ruined us, how he could have ruined me." She opened the small book. She found the date of the bank's collapse. Silas watched, leaning over her shoulder as she began to cross-reference his ranch ledger with her husband's private notes. The silence in the room became taut, electric. His breathing was heavy. Her fingers stopped. "There," she whispered. She pointed to an entry in Thomas's hand. "Harding, final transfer, $10,000. Croft's collateral." Eliza looked up at Silas, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a terrible, cold understanding. "My husband didn't act alone," she said, her voice shaking. "He was a partner. It looks like Mr. Harding was using my husband to siphon the money, and then when Thomas died, he framed a dead man." She pointed back to Silas's ledger. "And this debt Harding holds over your ranch, it's paper. He was planning to take this place, Mr. Croft, just as he took my home." The revelation settled between them, heavy as a shroud. He saw it all. Harding's smugness, his eagerness to exile her. It wasn't justice. It was a cleanup. She was the one loose thread. He looked at the woman in his chair, her face pale in the lamplight, her hand resting protectively on the small book that held the truth. She was not a burden. She was his only ally. She was a witness. She was the key. Eliza, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of it all, slumped, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion. Her head nodded, her eyes fluttering closed, and she fell asleep right there, her cheek resting on the open, damning ledgers. Silas stood there for a long time, just watching her. The woman who tamed his horses, the woman who fed his children, the woman who had just unraveled the conspiracy that was meant to destroy him. He turned, walked to the hall, and returned with a heavy wool blanket. He draped it carefully over her shoulders, his rough hand brushing her hair. She was no longer just earning her keep. She was in the fight with him. Harding didn't wait long. He couldn't. The news that Eliza Vance was not only sheltered at the Croft Ranch, but was being protected, a position that implied alliance, must have reached him with the speed of a prairie fire. A loose thread was a nuisance. A loose thread being woven into the fabric of his most formidable neighbor's household was a threat. He arrived 3 days after the night of the ledgers, and this time he did not come with the righteous anger of a mob. He came with the cold, unassailable power of the law. Sheriff Brody rode beside him, his face a granite mask of discomfort, his badge glinting in the high noon sun. 2 deputies flanked them. This was not a plea. It was a siege. Silas saw them from the corral where he was working the gelding. The horse, sensing the tension, shied. Silas stilled it with a word, his body going unnervingly calm. He put down the lunge line. On the porch, Eliza, who had been shelling peas with the twins, felt the air change. Her hands stopped. The rhythmic thump of peas hitting the metal bowl ceased. Leo and Mia looked up, their small faces mirroring the sudden cold dread that had fallen over the ranch. "Go inside," Eliza whispered, her voice tight. "Now." The twins fled into the house without a word. Eliza stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Harding dismounted with a flourish, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He didn't wait for an invitation. "Croft," he boomed, his voice full of a sickening false authority. He strode forward, the sheriff and his men fanning out behind him. "I am here on official bank business." Silas walked out of the corral, his pace measured, his hands loose at his sides. He stopped a good 20 feet from Harding, a silent, immovable object. "You're not welcome here, Harding." "My welcome is irrelevant," Harding sneered, pulling a sheaf of papers from his breast pocket. "It has come to my attention that you are harboring a person of interest, a fugitive from the town's justice." "She's no fugitive," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "She is a material witness and a primary party to the financial ruin of this county." Harding's voice rose, playing to the deputies. "The bank, as the primary creditor of the entire Vance estate, is here to seize all assets. And that, Mr. Croft," he said, his eyes glittering with triumph, "now includes you." He thrust a paper at Silas. "You see, your late lamented friend Thomas Vance was not just a partner in business. He was your co-signatory on a high-risk commodities loan, a loan that is now in catastrophic default. The bank is calling it in. All of it. Today." Silas stared at the paper. A foreclosure notice. It was a lie, a fabrication, but it bore the stamp of the county judge. He felt the trap spring. He could see the intricate, venomous logic of it. Harding hadn't just come for Eliza. He'd come to silence the one man powerful enough to protect her, to ruin him, and to seize his ranch as the final, crowning jewel of his theft. The sheriff shifted, his face grim. "Silas, I'm sorry. Paper is legal. The judge's signature is valid. My hands are tied." Helplessness. It was a feeling Silas Croft despised, a poison he'd never allowed in his system. He could fight a man, a storm, a herd, but he couldn't fight a lie written on paper and blessed by the law. He had lost. He had opened his home to save her, and in doing so, had given his enemy the very weapon he needed to destroy him. "That's a lie," the voice came from the porch, clear and cold as well water. It didn't waver. Eliza Vance walked down the steps, her gaze fixed, not on Silas, but on the man who had ruined her. She wasn't the dust-streaked victim from the edge of town. Her hair was pulled back. Her dress was clean, and she carried nothing but the small, leather-bound ledger. Harding's face, so full of triumphant malice, went utterly, instantly pale. He recognized the book. His eyes darted to it, a flicker of raw animal panic. "Mrs. Vance," he stammered, attempting to regain his composure. "This is a private matter. You should go inside." "It stopped being a private matter," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength, when you decided to forge that document. And it stopped being a private matter when you decided to frame a dead man to cover your own. The sheriff turned his full attention to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cautious but sharp, "that is a very serious accusation." "And I," Eliza replied, stepping into the center of the yard, "have very serious proof." She held up the ledger. "You all knew my husband. He was weak. He was a fool. But he was meticulous. This is his private ledger, the one you were so desperate to find, Mr. Harding, when you personally oversaw the seizure of my home." Harding's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "This book," Eliza continued, her voice ringing in the dead-hot silence, "details every transaction you and he made, not as banker and client, but as partners." She turned to the sheriff, her eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fire that eclipsed her fear. "Sheriff Brody, you've been investigating the bank's collapse. You've been looking for the town's money. You assumed Thomas Vance took it and fled, but he didn't. He couldn't, because he was already dead." She took a step toward the lawman, holding the book open. "See for yourself. The final transfer. The one that bankrupted the bank and stole this county's future. It was for $10,000, moved to an out-of-state account in Mr. Harding's name. And the date," she paused, letting the words land, "is 2 days after my husband's funeral. 2 days after he was in the ground, and Mr. Harding was the only man with access to the vaults." Silence. The only sound was the wind. "He used my husband," Eliza's voice dropped, thick with a fury she had never known she possessed. "He used him to siphon the money. And when Thomas died suddenly, he saw his chance. He dumped the remaining assets, created the panic, and blamed a dead man. He framed his own partner to take the fall. He exiled me to silence the one person who might find this." She looked at the foreclosure notice in Silas's hand. "And that is a forgery, because the only collateral on that loan was in my husband's name, and it was paid in full 3 months ago." Harding, his face a mask of purple rage, finally broke. "She's lying. That's forged. It's inadmissible." He lunged for her, his hands out, trying to snatch the book. In a motion so fast it was almost invisible, Silas's arm shot out like a steel bar, catching Harding square in the chest and sending him sprawling into the dust. "You stay put." Sheriff Brody's hand was on his gun. He looked from Harding on the ground to Eliza, to the ledger she was holding out to him. He took it. He read the entry. He flipped a page. He looked up, his face carved from ice. "Mr. Harding," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you are under arrest, not just for fraud, for grand larceny, and for perjury." The power in the yard didn't just shift, it shattered and reformed, and the man who had arrived as the town's savior was now its prisoner. Sheriff Brody's face was carved from granite, a mask of grim, necessary duty. He didn't waste a single word on Harding's sputtering, red-faced denials. He simply nodded once to his deputies. "Get him on his horse." Cuffed. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was the punctuation mark on the end of an era. It was a sound that broke the spell of fear Harding had held over the county. The banker, his fine suit stained with the dust he held in such contempt, was hauled to his feet. He looked at Eliza, his eyes two burning coals of pure, undiluted hatred, a silent promise of revenge. But Eliza, her hand still resting on the small ledger, met his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply watched until he, the powerful man, was the first to break contact, his eyes darting away in a final, pathetic admission of defeat. The deputies mounted, leading Harding between them, a prisoner bound for his own jail. Sheriff Brody lingered, his gaze on the ledger in her hand. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice heavy with a respect he had never shown her before. "That book, it'll have to be entered as evidence, ma'am. You understand?" Eliza nodded. "Of course, Sheriff." He reached for it, then paused, his hand hovering. "What you did here today, it wasn't just about this ranch. You just gave every man and woman in this county a chance to get their future back." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was a profound apology and a salute, all in one. He nodded to Silas. "Croft," and then he too was gone, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust that settled back to earth, leaving the ranch in a silence that was vast and suddenly deeply peaceful. The news of Harding's arrest didn't just spread through Redemption Creek. It detonated. It was a shockwave that shattered the very foundation of their reality. The deputies had barely reached the edge of town before the story was leaping from lip to lip, from the mercantile to the saloon to the white-steepled church. Harding, a thief. Harding, the partner of the man they all cursed. It was impossible, and yet it was true. And with that truth came a more terrible, more personal revelation. The woman they had exiled, the woman they had called thief and accomplice, the woman they had spat on and marched out of town with nothing. She was the one who had been telling the truth. She was the one who had been wronged, not just by her husband, not just by the banker, but by them. The collective guilt was a physical weight, a sickness that settled in their stomachs. They saw their own faces, twisted with self-righteous fury, as they had formed that mob. They heard their own voices, baying for a justice that was, in fact, the deepest injustice. The town's shame was absolute, a bitter ash in their mouths. It was not a planned delegation. It was a spontaneous, shame-faced pilgrimage. The next morning, as the sun began to bake the dew from the ground, a small group of riders appeared on the road to the Croft Ranch. It was Henderson, the feed merchant, who had been overcharging Silas for years. It was Baker, the blacksmith, who had been the loudest voice in the mob calling for Eliza's expulsion. It was two farmers, men who had lost everything, who had cursed Thomas Vance's name and spat at his wife's feet. They didn't ride up to the house. They stopped at the main gate, 100 yards distant, a cluster of miserable, defeated men, twisting their hats in their hands, waiting. Silas saw them from the barn. He watched them for a full minute, his face an unreadable mask. Eliza came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, the twins peeking out from behind her skirts, their small faces anxious. Finally, Silas strode toward the gate, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He stopped on his side, not bothering to unlatch it. "What?" His voice was not welcoming. Henderson, his face flushed a deep, painful red, acted as the spokesman. "Silas, Mr. Croft, we heard about Harding." He couldn't meet the rancher's eyes. "We came. Well, we see that west pasture fence of yours is down, the one Harding's men tore through." He gestured vaguely. And we brought tools. We thought maybe we could give a hand to mend it." It was the only apology they knew how to make, an offer of labor for a sin too deep to be named. Silas looked at them, at their downcast eyes, at their calloused hands gripping hammers and post-hole diggers. He gave a single curt nod. "The fence is down for 2 miles, he said, his voice flat. "Start at the creek." He turned, then paused, looking back at them. "This ranch, my family, we don't need your apologies, but we will accept your labor." He walked away, leaving them at the gate. He was offering them a chance to work, not a path to forgiveness. Eliza watched as the men, humbled and silent, unlatched the gate themselves and began the long walk to the pasture. An hour later, as the sun beat down, she walked out, carrying a heavy wooden bucket of fresh well water. The men stopped, startled, wiping sweat from their brows. She said nothing. She just set the bucket on the ground, the dipper hooked over its edge. "Drink," she said, her voice quiet, neutral. "It's a hot day." They stammered their thanks, but she was already walking back to the house. She had given them water. She would not, and could not, give them absolution. That they would have to find for themselves. Her dignity was her own, and it was clear to everyone, finally, that it had never been theirs to grant. The fence was mended. The men from the town, their debt of labor paid, had tipped their hats and ridden away, their faces still holding the shadow of their shame. A fragile peace settled over Redemption Creek, and with it a new, unspoken respect for the woman at the Croft Ranch. Eliza's name was clear. The stigma was gone, lifted as cleanly as Harding's arrest, and with that, the terms of her presence had evaporated. She was no longer a fugitive. She was no longer earning her keep. She was, for the first time in her life, truly free. And that freedom, she knew, meant that she had to leave. She had come as a burden, stayed as a worker, and then briefly, as an ally. She could not, in good conscience, remain as an obligation. That evening, she packed her small valise. It was a simple task. She owned almost nothing. She folded the one spare dress she had washed and mended, her movements neat, final. She was in the small barn room, the door open to the cooling air, when Silas found her. He didn't make a sound, but she felt his presence. He just stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light, watching her place her hairbrush into the bag. His face was unreadable, a mask of prairie dust and shadow. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm leaving, Mr. Croft," she said, not looking at him. "My name is clear. The town is safe. You don't owe me anything more, and my debt to you is paid. Where will you go?" "I don't know. West, I suppose. I can find work. I can teach." She closed the valise. The sound of the clasp clicking shut was unnaturally loud in the silence. It felt like the closing of a door, a final, painful act of dignity. "You can't!" The cry was a desperate wail. Mia and Leo stood behind their father, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. They had overheard. "You can't go, Eliza! You can't!" Mia ran to her, grabbing her skirt, just as she had done at the edge of town. "You're our Eliza. You can't leave us." Leo, his small body trembling, looked at his silent, unmoving father. And a flash of the same desperate fury he'd shown that first day ignited in his eyes. He ran to Silas, beating his small fists against the man's legs. "Daddy, you have to stop her. You have to." He looked up, his face a mess of tears and frustration. "Daddy, you have to marry her. You promised. You have to." This time the words were not an absurd public demand. They were a desperate, private plea. This time, they were the only words that made sense. Silas looked down at his son, then at Eliza, who stood frozen, her hand on her bag, her heart breaking. And then the rarest of things happened. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Silas Croft's mouth. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "that's a matter for the lady." He stepped aside, walked past her into the small room, and went to the tiny desk where she'd kept her notes. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his own coat pocket. "I'm not a man for speeches, Eliza." He turned, holding the paper out to her. "But I am a man of my word. This is a contract." Confused, her hands shaking, she took it. She unrolled it. Her eyes scanned the legal text, and her breath caught. It wasn't a marriage certificate. It wasn't a job offer. It was a deed. A deed, properly drawn and filed by the sheriff that morning, making her a half-owner of the Croft Ranch. She looked up stunned, her eyes searching his. Silas, I don't understand. It's a partnership, he said simply, his gaze steady, holding hers. This ranch, it was failing. I was failing. You saved it. You saved us. This is just the paperwork catching up to the truth. This is a partnership, Eliza. If you'll have it. She stared at him, the weight of his respect, a more profound, more intimate gesture than any romantic declaration. He saw her as his equal. And the marriage? She whispered, the word tasting strange on her lips. He took a step closer, finally closing the distance between them. He gently took the deed from her hand and set it on the cot. Then he took her hand, his calloused thumb brushing her knuckles. That, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, is a partnership too, if you'll have me. She didn't have to speak. Her answer was in the tears that finally, after all this time, welled in her eyes, not of grief, but of a profound, impossible joy. She nodded, a single sharp motion. Yes, yes, Silas. The twins, who had been watching in breathless silence, exploded, their cheers echoing out into the twilight, sealing the contract, sealing the vow, sealing the fractured, broken pieces of their lives into a single, unbreakable whole. And that, folks, is where this chapter comes to a close. But the frontier is endless, and so are the tales it holds. If you believe the true spirit of the West lives in stories of grit, heart, and redemption, just like the one you heard today, then you've found your campfire. Join our posse. Hit that subscribe button for true Western stories and ring that notification bell so you never miss a ride. And if this story spoke to you, give it a like. It lets us know which trails are worth following. Until next time, stay brave and ride tall.